This morning. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our fourth and final Eggs in the Economy of 2019. My name is Kristen Strom. I serve as President and CEO of Common Sense Policy Roundtable. For those of you who haven't joined us prior, and I do see a lot of familiar faces, Eggs in the Economy is a quarterly gathering to learn about different policy issues that are critical to issues facing Colorado. The goal is to bring people together of different perspectives to talk, listen, occasionally disagree, and of course to eat eggs. So hopefully you all get some. If everything goes according to plan, we'll all walk out of here a little more educated too. At CSPR, we believe strongly in the need for civility, open dialogue, and conversation driven by facts. We believe sound fiscal and economic research is essential to uphold Colorado's economic vitality, future, and individual opportunity. And we also believe it's important for Republicans, Democrats, and the rest of us to break bread occasionally. So for all of those legislators and elected officials in attendance today, if you could please stand. Thank you so much for your service and for being here. So before we get to the program, I'd like to introduce CSPR's Board of Directors. If those here today could please stand and be recognized. Our board is comprised of some remarkable individuals. They're bright, committed, and they all care about Colorado in the truest sense. It's an honor to work alongside of this terrific group of people. I'd also like to thank our Leaders Circle and Free Enterprise Champion members in the room today. We value your membership, and without your generous support, we'd not be able to conduct the sound research so important to moving policy dialogue in our state. So we're operating on a pretty tight schedule today. We have a lot of great presentations and speakers to hear from. So we're going to be limiting Q&A at the end of each speaker to roughly 5 to 10 minutes. If we don't get to your question, though, I'm sure that the speakers will be able to stay afterwards. So, to get to the program, I'd like to start off by introducing our first speaker today, CSPR Energy Resources Fellow Simon Lomax. Simon has spent more than 20 years working in journalism, government, and public affairs. He started as a research assistant at the Queensland Department of Transportation in Brisbane, Australia. He later became a journalist reporting for newspapers, trade publications, and financial newswires in Australia, the Deep South, and in Washington, D.C. In 2006 and 2007, Simon was a congressional fellow with the American Political Science Association, which sent him to Capitol Hill to work on climate change legislation. After the APSA fellowship, he covered energy and climate policy for Argus Media, Bloomberg News during the first term of the Obama administration. He became a U.S. citizen in 2008 and changed careers in 2012, leaving the newsroom to work in public affairs. Since 2012, Simon has worked with think tanks, trade associations, and business groups to advocate for limited government, free enterprise approaches to public policy. Please help me welcome Simon.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. First of all, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my co-author on this report, Chris Brown. You may have heard of him, and he'll be speaking a little bit later. And likewise, I'm very grateful to Kristen, to the CSPR board, and to all of the supporters of the work of this free enterprise think tank. As someone who became a U.S. citizen at the age of 30, I can say without reservation that the American system of free enterprise is very special, and it's not something that should be taken for granted. When we think about the benefits of free enterprise, a lot of things sort of naturally spring to mind. Jobs, economic opportunity, technological innovation, competitive markets and consumer choice. But another benefit of the free enterprise system that kind of flies under the radar is the tax revenue that's generated by workers and business owners and investors in the private economy. And whether you'd like to see more government spending or less, higher taxes or lower taxes, I think it's important that we all remember where tax revenue comes from in the first place. And that's the free enterprise system and the private economic activity that it makes possible. Now, our new report on oil and gas development is focused on property taxes, but before diving into the findings, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the importance of property taxes. Because even though property taxes play a major fiscal role in our nation, their importance is often overlooked. So nationwide, local and state governments collect more than $500 billion in property taxes every year. And for scale, that's about twice the amount collected by the federal government in Medicare payroll taxes. This graph on the right of the slide comes from the Urban Institute, and what the Urban Institute did was take all of the state and local revenue that's collected nationwide and compared the totals to one another. And property taxes is the yellow column on the left-hand side of the graph. And it's bigger than general sales taxes, bigger than selective sales taxes, it's bigger than state income taxes, and it's bigger even than the charges and fees that often serve the same role as taxes these days. And finally, here in Colorado, every year, local governments collect about $9 billion in tax revenue, which is more than the state's individual and corporate income tax revenues combined. Which brings us to our new report, the local revenue impacts of near-term oil and gas development. Historically, most of the research about oil and gas development in Colorado has been statewide in nature. And so that's not left very much information at the local level for local officials and local stakeholders to use. And following the passage of Senate Bill 181, however, local governments now have an expanded role in making regulatory and permitting decisions about siting new oil and gas production facilities. And so this report is a first step toward better understanding the local contributions of oil and gas development so that permitting and regulatory decisions under SB 181 can be fully informed by the facts. And those facts include property tax revenues, which in Colorado we use to support a wide range of essential public services. So to explore this kind of general proposition, we looked at 5 cities and towns along the Front Range: Aurora, Broomfield, Commerce City, Erie, and Johnstown. And using publicly available information, including approved local operator agreements and state location assessments and other regulatory filings, we developed 2 scenarios for near-term oil and gas development across these 5 local jurisdictions. I would encourage you to take a look at the full study because we spent a lot of time explaining the steps that we took to develop these estimates across these 2 scenarios. But here's a quick overview of the steps that we took. First, we identified more than 70 locations where oil and gas production facilities are likely to be developed in the near term. To be sure, this is not intended to be an upper or lower limit on the amount of future oil and gas development that's planned for any given area, but the regulatory documents that we reviewed are a very strong indicator of the amount of new oil and gas development that is planned for the near term. Second, we examined recent production data from the DJ Basin to estimate how much oil and gas these new facilities may produce over their first 10 years of operation. Third, we estimated the total value of this oil and gas. And fourth, we applied the relevant property tax formulas to these values. Before we get to the findings, there's something that we need to cover very quickly, but is absolutely critical when you're looking at this issue. and that is the tax assessment rate for oil and gas. Now, in Colorado, the assessment rate for all classes of property determines how much of a property's actual value will be subject to local mill levies. Currently, the tax assessment rate for residential property in Colorado is 7.15%. For commercial property, it's 29%, but for oil and gas, it's 87.5%. Effectively, this means the property tax rate for oil and gas in Colorado is 3 times higher than commercial property and 12 times higher than residential property. And this higher effective tax rate had a huge impact on our findings. In the 2 scenarios we examined, we found between $1.39 and $1.85 billion in new property taxes in the 5 cities and towns we looked at over a 10-year period. These revenues would support a wide range of local services provided by cities and towns, counties and special districts. We're talking about public education, road construction, police and fire departments, water and sanitation infrastructure, parks and recreation services, among others. In the table on the right of this slide, you can see the property tax totals from near-term oil and gas development broken out by each of the cities we studied. But we also provided more detailed estimates about where this property tax revenue would go. Because as you know, property tax bills are divided between municipalities, counties, public schools, and other special districts. And as we examined these numbers, one big trend became clear right away across all 5 cities and towns, and that was most of the new property tax revenue was earmarked for just one purpose: K through 12 education. According to our estimates, the school districts that serve these 5 communities could receive between $822 million to $1.1 billion over 10 years. Now, to put those numbers in context, we turned this 10-year total into an annual average, and then we compared that annual average to per pupil spending and average teacher salaries. Here's what we found. With this amount of revenue, you could give teachers in those districts a raise of between 31 and 42%, roughly $18,000 to $24,000 per year. Or you could hire something in the neighborhood of 2,400 to 3,200 new teachers. Either way, you could increase classroom spending by about $560 to $750 per pupil. Now, we did the same kind of size and scope exercise for cities and towns as well. And in this setting, near-term oil and gas development could generate between $194 million and $258 million in new property tax revenues over 10 years. That is enough money to perform substantial repairs on the local road network. You could grind down and resurface 600 to 800 miles, or lane miles, of local roads with brand new asphalt overlay, for example. And for scale, 600 miles to 800 miles is roughly twice the length of the state of Colorado. I should note that this example only applies to municipal roads. It's quite possible that county governments, which could themselves receive more than $200 million in new revenue over 10 years, would use this money for infrastructure improvements as well. Before concluding, though, I want to be clear that these size and scope exercises, they're not policy recommendations. We didn't produce this study to recommend staffing levels for school districts or spending priorities for local governments. We're not saying how these revenues should be spent. Instead, we're trying to convey the magnitude of these revenues to make them more tangible and less abstract. As a recovering journalist, one of the things that my editors would always say in the newsroom was show, don't tell. And that's our attempt to show rather than tell how significant these revenues might be in a local setting. We understand that local officials have a difficult task juggling many different budget priorities with finite resources. And so all these findings suggest, if anything, is that growing the local tax base is one way to make those budget decisions a little easier. So in conclusion, some closing thoughts. To be sure, this analysis is not intended to provide the final word on the local economic contributions of oil and gas in Colorado, and it doesn't attempt to predict oil and gas-related property taxes down to the last dollar and cent over a period of 10 years. Rather, it has a more realistic goal. That's communicating the potential size and scope of these potential revenue streams at the local level. Because these fiscal considerations are important. And unfortunately, they are not immediately obvious to some policymakers and some members of the public. And as a result, to date, they've been largely overlooked. So this analysis takes a step toward correcting this oversight and ensuring that the implementation of Senate Bill 181, both locally and at the state level, is fully informed by the facts. Thank you for your time and for your interest in our work. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them here or offline at the end of our program, depending on how we're doing on time. I think we have time for a few questions. Mm-hmm. So scenario 1 and scenario 2, basically the difference is the assumed well count between, basically how many wells would be located on the 70-plus sites that we looked at. And we basically have scenario 1 runs at about 800 wells across those 70 locations, and scenario 2 assumes about 1,100 wells. Those are rough numbers. We have the detailed figures in the report itself. But it basically reflects that in some cases there are locations that have been determined for future oil and gas development, but well counts haven't been developed for those sites yet. And so we wanted to account for some of the back and forth and flexibility that may play out, especially as local governments and state regulators and operators kind of work together to find the right fit in terms of well counts for these locations. Does that make sense?
If I could ask a very broad question,
Mm-hmm.
what's really driving the engine here? Is it economics or is it regulation?
You mean in oil and gas?
Yeah, as far as the future goes. I mean, what's going to determine? Is it going to be oil prices? Or is it going to be what happens under the gold dome?
I think it's both. I think it's a combination of both.
One rank on 1 and 2.
Joey, I really do think it's both. I think if you want to if you're tracking this issue going forward, I think probably the best way to determine how much of it is market and how much of it is regulation is to look at permitting trends and especially rig counts in Colorado compared to other states. And that will probably give you some indication as to how much of the trends are being driven by what's happening at the state capitol, what's happening at the COGCC, what's happening at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, what's happening at the local level. Because so much of the implementation of Senate Bill 181 has still to be determined, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. But if you were to look at permitting and rig count trends in other states and then look at Colorado and how it compares, that would probably be a useful clue to answer your question. Okay, we have time for one more question. Anyone? Anyone?
Well, I think these locations, were you looking to kind of differentiate between cities that seem to be open and not open to this?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, Ed. That didn't factor into our selection of these locations so much as they were a really interesting cross-section of different communities that are along the Front Range, that are in the DJ Basin, but they're very different sizes. And also, I guess the one thing that they all needed to have in common in order to be selected was that there were actual plans for near-term oil and gas development, on the horizon. So that really was what drove the selection. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I also want to be sure that you know that this is not an exhaustive list of the municipalities where oil and gas development is planned in the DJ Basin. But the purpose of this white paper or this report really was to illustrate what some of the tax contributions and some of the fiscal impacts could be when local communities are considering oil and gas development proposals. Yeah, okay, all right. Kristen says it's all right. So
What will be the impact of electric cars on these projections?
that's a good question that was, I guess, outside the scope of our paper. But I would say, if you look at, I'm going to lean a little bit on my past experience as an electricity markets reporter and oil and natural gas markets reporter. I think if you look at the utilization rate of electric vehicles, both historical and what's projected, oil and gas is still going to be a major mainstay in the transportation sector for a long time to come. Whether you're talking about oil that is refined into fuels that go into internal combustion engines, or if you talk about the electricity itself that goes into electric vehicles, that electricity comes from somewhere, and actually a lot of it comes from natural gas-fired power plants. So I don't see it as something that's going to as something that's going to diminish oil and gas in the near term in any significant way. Just my opinion.
Thank you, Simon. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a familiar face, CSPR Director of Policy and Research, Chris Brown. Today, excitingly, for the third year in a row, CSPR is going to release our Budget Then and Now report. It offers a comprehensive view of how spending by the state has grown and changed over the past 2 decades. The study presents a big picture view of how spending by the state of Colorado has changed, and in a fun way, too. So, Chris, welcome, and we look forward to hearing about the study.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Simon, and welcome to all of you for joining us again. Yeah, so as Kristen pointed out, this is our third year releasing the Budget Then and Now, which, again, presents a high-level snapshot of our state's spending priorities. Ultimately, budgeting is about priorities, and so as we look to the legislative session, we know that the discussion will get very detailed, weedy, and very siloed, but we hope that, again, this can present a little bit of perspective on where the state is currently and where it's been. So during the last legislative session, the state legislature approved about just over $30.4 billion in total state appropriations for the current fiscal year, which runs from July of this year through the end of June next year. And so this is what we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at a snapshot from 2000 through our current budget cycle. So there's a lot of ways to slice this information. There's a lot of ways that this type of data gets presented. And so we wanted to show expenditure spending by departments. You've seen it sliced maybe on where it's collected, sort of at the source, sliced it by revenue, by income taxes, sales taxes. If you followed the debate around Proposition CC, you may have been focused on appropriations at the fund level, because that's very relevant here in Colorado. As we, under Tabor, that's where various restrictions are imposed on different funds. Just for a little bit of context, when Tabor was passed, in 1994, about 54% of state appropriations were subject to the Tabor spending limit. As one of those areas, particularly cash funds through enterprises, has grown, less than a third, or specifically about 28% of total appropriations you'll be seeing today are subject to the Tabor spending limits. So this is one of the animations that we produced along with the report. I'd encourage you to go to our website and take a look at how this plays out. But I wanted to show this to you today so that we could take a look and see how spending has changed again, from 2000 through 2020. So apologize for some of the small text, but I did include colors, so maybe you can just follow the colors. Just to kind of orient you with what you're looking at, each bar is a state department. At the top, you have education, then healthcare, higher education, human services. In 2020, the top 5 state departments equaled about 75% of total state spending. Now that makes sense. Those agencies are the ones that are tasked with really spending money. They're spending on roads, spending on schools, teachers, buildings, healthcare. The other agencies, the rest of the 24 listed here, are tasked with regulating, enforcing laws, managing state parks, and so they don't necessarily have a direct transfer role, which is why those top 5 obviously stand out. So I'm going to run this quickly. We even get some sound effects. Great. Drum roll. So what you can see is that over time, each category is changing. Things are jumping around, but we can see the total appropriations, again, by department, by year, and a change, if you will, in some of those categories. So, and here we end up in 2020. Again, I would encourage you to go back, take a look at this yourself, and see if you can see how policy plays out. I'm going to play it one more time, slow it down just a little bit, but if you can, I think I have a laser pointer here. Focus, I want to see if you can catch 2 particular years. So 2009 was a recession, but it was also the year the state passed FASTER, so significant increase in tax revenue for transportation. So transportation, transportation is here in pink, okay? So follow that. In 2009, you'll see that change. 2009 was also start of the recession, followed by significant increase in unemployment. We saw an increase in those enrolled in the state's healthcare Medicaid program. 2014 was another pivotal year where the state expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, and so also track healthcare policy and financing, which is blue. So 2 tasks, 2009 and transportation, and then again 2014 healthcare policy and financing. So we're tracking out of the, what did I say? Blue, sorry, green. So 2009, we have FASTER and transportation funds significantly increase. At the same time, we have a recession, increase in unemployment, increase in enrollment in the state's healthcare program, and then in 2014, state expands Medicaid and draws down a significant amount of federal revenue and increases expenditure for healthcare policy and financing. So it's, again, you could probably, if you want to stay with me till 5 p.m., you could probably go through 100 different policy scenarios and see them play out, but nonetheless sort of interesting to take a look at and see again how over time priorities have shifted, or what the priorities ultimately are. So I'd be remiss if I didn't show, that was total appropriations, and I have to say that you may think research is me sitting in front of a computer clicking away, which it most often is, but I actually had to go down to the state capitol and go to the Joint Budget Committee library and flip through the old appropriation reports to actually get some of these numbers. So this might be the first time some of this information is actually displayed in aggregate, which is total operating appropriations and total capital construction fund appropriations. This is just the general fund. There's another animation on our website that is the same animation for the general fund, but this highlights the change in the share of the general fund for each agency from 2000 to 2010 to 2020. So again, just to highlight one item, if you look at the yellow bars, that's the change in the share of the budget for each department from 2010 to 2020. So between 2010 and 2020, again, healthcare, this is in the general fund. So this is not directly impacted by an increase in Medicaid funding, but nonetheless, it has been impacted by an increase in overall enrollment and higher healthcare related costs. So it's increased by over 7%, while education as a share of the general fund way over on the right has declined by roughly 12-13%. Okay? During this 20-year period, the state has experienced a little over a third, 35% increase in total population. So obviously the state has continued to grow. But I think what I wanted to highlight with this slide is that while we've seen a shift in the priorities and the relative expenditure on each department, the overall pie has grown. So the bar on the right is total spending per Coloradan adjusted for inflation. So in 2000, spending roughly a little over $4,000 per Coloradan. Again, this is in current dollars. Today, in fiscal year 2020, that's a little over $5,500 per Coloradan. And then this breaks it down by fund. The general fund on a per Coloradan basis had a slight dip in 2010 because of the recession, but cash funds, as you can see, has grown in each subsequent sort of cycle. So again, just a little bit another way to sort of highlight some of the shifts and some of the changes that we've seen. So I will leave it there and let you go to the website and take a look and follow the bars and see which ones win. And I'll encourage you, if you have any questions, feel free to follow up. But again, we're hoping that this can be as a resource as we have another session coming up to provide a little context for where the state currently stands and again, where it's been. So thank you. Questions, if there are any questions, yeah. We'll leave those for the panelists. Yeah, please, Buzz.
Chris, just give a little better explanation between general fund and non-general fund, meaning the federal funds that come in. I think there's
Sure.
some confusion about the total dollars, and it might be helpful to just clarify that.
Yeah, it's a great question, yeah. So each year there are revenue streams that go to different funds, cash funds, general funds, and then go to the federal government and then are allocated back to the state. And so cash funds are dedicated to a very specific purpose and generally are most often are in the form of what are called enterprises. And so they have a very specific purpose. The general fund generally has, the state legislature has a little bit more discretion over where those funds go on an annual basis. There are requirements, there are some required increases in those funds that the annual increases are ultimately go to, but nonetheless, those funds represent ultimately who has discretion over where they're spent. So I didn't have more there, apologize, but please.
If you were to answer the question, if you look at these numbers, it looks like, oh, well, it looks like we've decided that healthcare is more important and education is less important, just based on what you see here. Probably that is not true. So what would you say is the reason for this? Is it you want Democrats, Republicans, policy, circumstances? What do you attribute the reason for this change in priorities?
On the record again, yeah, you asked some good questions. No, I think that it's the outcome of policy, and I think that when you look at putting together policy, the long-term ramifications might not necessarily be what the initial thought was, and so it's clearly because of the way that the policy was designed that then has required these funds to be appropriate to it. So it's really, it comes down to policy. This may not have been the intent originally, but this is how the policy has played out over 10, 15 years. Please. Oh, sorry.
And you had this up there, I apologize for missing it, and I appreciate how you did that with the shifting bars. Yes, thank you. Did you look at anything, and again, if I missed this, I apologize, with last year, with them way over appropriating money that clearly they did not have or forecast for, that there would be that big of a need for money coming into this year where we're still looking at growing programs and there's just no money. We can't pay for 2019, let alone moving forward. I mean, did any of your breakdowns or analysis kind of view, is it just a train wreck waiting to happen? Or is there-
Yeah, no, this was, again, just a snapshot of those appropriations reports. So we didn't dive into any specific year-over-year changes. Again, try the bigger context, and again, let the nuanced debates play out. I think that's what's, I mean, those debates are important, clearly, but we wanted to provide the context. Yeah. I'm sending it to them. They were very helpful in providing all of the resources. But
Chris, I see a lot of federal dollars in that chart.
Yeah.
How much of this is the state budget a function of Colorado priorities, and how much of it is a function of outside dollars? I mean, is the budget a document of policy and priority, or is it a document of bureaucratic inertia? I think it's neither.
I mean, you know, so the federal funds on a per Coloradan basis, you know, have remained somewhat flat.
Including healthcare?
That might come back through cash funds. Frankly, I think it might through the hospital provider fee. That might actually come back through the cash funds. It's a good question. You know, to your question, I think it's a combination of state priorities and I mean, obviously with healthcare, I think that is largely driven by the federal legislation. But some of the other changes you saw in transportation and education, and I think that there is nuance there. I mean, I think, again, part of it is undoubtedly driven by federal policy, but a lot of the debates that we're having as a state, I think, are driven by state decisions. Please. Okay, last one. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, the tool itself can be produced, you know, as long as you have that history of data, we could, you know, it's something that you can look at. Yeah, it's flexible in that way. It's not something that we've looked at specifically. Yeah, I mean, this is what is appropriated and maybe what the expectation is or what the law has required local government. This is, again, just state appropriations, so this is not local spending at all. So to the extent that there are local demands or local expectations that have been changed by state policy, that is not represented here. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay, now for what a lot of us have been waiting for, hear from some expert reporters in the field that have been covering the last election and are looking forward to this next legislative session and hopefully have a lot of inside information. It's my honor to have three of Colorado's top reporters here today. I'd like to welcome them to the stage now, if you could all turn on your mics. Let's start with Shaun. So Shaun Boyd, an award-winning reporter with more than 20 years of experience. As CBS 4's political specialist, she covers the state legislature, national political stories, and election coverage. Help me welcome Ed Sealover is a veteran reporter for the Denver Business Journal, covering government, transportation, economic development, beer, and the tourism hospitality industry. And he does cover a lot of good brewery information. So, Ed. And last but not least, Joey Bunch, senior writer, deputy managing editor, and in his words, the bon vivant for Colorado politics. He's also my favorite Alabama football fan besides my husband, so roll tide, Joey. We're honored to have you join us today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's get started. Joey, let's start with you. Thoughts on the 2019 election results?
Well, the state, can everybody hear me okay? I'm not sure I'm doing this right. I think I speak loudly enough. But, I thought we were a blue state till the last election, and now I'm not so sure anymore. But, I looked at the who voted in the last election, and it was a young demographic. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm saying that backwards. It was actually an older demographic. I guess in Denver, if we had some kind of drug on the ballot, maybe the turnout among younger voters would have been differently. So I don't know how much we can read into this November for next November. Democrats and younger voters tend to turn out stronger in the next election. But no doubt about it, the Democrats are in the catbird seat, and I don't look for that to change at the state capitol after next year. We've got 4 competitive seats. We're such a gerrymandered state. There's not a lot of suspense if you're covering politics anymore when it comes to these elections, because we've got 4 competitive seats in the Senate, and 3 of them are held by Republicans, and Republicans will be lucky to hang on to, I think, 2 of them next election. In the House, Republicans would have to flip 9 seats. So basically, Jared Polis is playing with the House's money in the next election, because I think he'll still have Democratic majorities. Normally, I went back over time, and normally when the chambers flip, you'll see the party in charge be really aggressive the first session, then back off the second. I don't think we're going to see him back off, but I don't know. They did so much liberal stuff in the last session. I don't know what they could do as an encore in this one. Maybe Ed can tell us. Ed, what are the Democrats going to do for an encore?
Yeah, Ed, what are your thoughts on November, especially as it relates to Proposition CC? I'd be curious.
Well, I'm a little like Joey. I think it's hard to extrapolate a full 2020 prediction from such a small turnout in 2019. But I think it continues the trend that Coloradans like Democrats in theory, but not the spending policies that most Democrats are advancing at the State House. It's almost like Colorado is saying, look, we continue to remind you we hate Donald Trump, but we also hate some of the policies that you're putting forward. I think what it does is it sets up an election in 2020 and a session in 2020 where the legislature and others who have sought increased funding, whether it be for roads or for education or for other causes, have been consistently reprimanded. We're not going to give you this money. We want you to fix our education and fix transportation and find it somewhere else. And it sets up a big conflict in the 2020 legislative session as to whether that will actually happen. We've heard this discussion, we've heard this debate for years. The problem is that we see 2 competing sides. One, and this is largely from the Democratic side, saying, look, we don't have the money in the budget to fix transportation or fix education at the scale that we need to do it. And on the other side, you have Republicans saying, no, we do, and the voters are telling us to do that, but rarely do we see a focused policy come out of the Republicans to say, okay, here's where we're taking the money from, and here's where we're going to put it to. I think this sets up almost a demand from voters that the 2 sides have got to work together to find that. I'm not optimistic that will be the debate.
Shaun, you covered, the election cycle pretty thoroughly. What were your takeaways?
I wasn't surprised by the outcomes of either measure, but I was surprised by the margins.
Yeah.
I expected a slimmer margin for CC, a larger margin for DD. I think a few things played into CC. Ed talked about Democrats thinking, we don't have the money in the budget. But I think in some ways the education advocates and the CDOT types of the world have hurt themselves, have shot themselves in the foot because they're constantly saying, legislature, you're not doing your job, you're not giving us money. And so to voters, they send the message, you know, the legislature has the money, but they're not giving it to us. So voters say, you know what? Spend the money you've got. Put something more toward transportation, education, and then maybe we'll give you a little bit more to spend. So I think, you know, that's one of the things that probably hurt in the CC.
Ed, what, you recently just had a great story on paid family leave, and I know that that's going to be one of the big issues headed into the 2020 session. What are the top of mind issues that you think will be priority this session?
Well, I mean, you hit on it right there. I think paid family leave is the biggest piece of the majority Democratic legislative agenda that was left undone from 2019. I've had the opportunity, luckily that you all haven't, to sit through the paid family medical leave task force. And I'm sorry, I see Diana, who's actually a member of that task force out there. She and I have spent way too much time together this summer. But the nuances that are going into this policy show how important it is for the people who are pushing it. And for those of you who may not be familiar, this is the idea that every employer in the state must provide paid time off for their employees, and the way that it's been structured in the last 6 legislative sessions, in which it's failed 5 times in the last 6 legislative sessions, is there would be a fee put on the employees' paychecks to create a $1 to $2 billion state-run system for administering this. I think what's really interesting is to see the possibility that this could come to a head, not between the Democrats and Republicans so much as between the Democrats in the legislature and the governor. Governor Polis has put out there saying, I'm uncomfortable with the size of this program and how long it would take to get it going. I would like you all to consider doing this much like we do workers' compensation insurance. Establish a mandate for what every employer must provide, make them buy insurance to do this, and move out of the way. The advocates for this program have said, I'm uncomfortable with that. I think that would lead to things such as discrimination in hiring by employers, and I think that's what you're really going to see come to a head. But rather than go on about each policy, I will say that is going to be the microcosm for the big picture, which is how much more the legislature will demand of private employers in this session. I think you are going to look at that potential mandate coming. There is talk about asking employers to increase the amount of tax they're paying into the unemployment insurance trust fund to beef the fund up before the next economic downturn hits. We're looking at potentially setting up a state-run retirement savings system that would have to be, if not funded, at least put into by all employers that don't offer retirement savings. And, you know, we're looking at other things. I mean, heck, we haven't even started talking about changing the Labor Peace Act yet. That is going to come right back to the question of what is the role of the employer in terms of state mandates, and how much is the state going to require?
Shaun, do you want to add to that? Where do you see priorities falling? I know that the list is long.
I think Ed hit it on the head when he said, you know, this is not going to be a great session for business owners. I mean, that's my sense too, and just talking to lawmakers. And he ticked off most of them. I think the 3 big issues are going to be the family, the paid family and medical leave, what opponents call fam-lies, had different words for that down there, and the retirement, and then also the public option, you know, which we haven't even talked about at this point, and that is going to be an enormous battle down there, and I think that's governor's top priority this next session. But, you know, just in talking to lawmakers, they've got regulatory reform that they're talking about. Some are uncomfortable with the Department of Labor implementing these new rules for overtime, and they'd like the legislature to be able to do something about that. There's a bill to simplify the tax code. That's a good one for business owners, I think. You know, automobile dealers, they're going to deal with a bill that will let people buy their cars online. They won't have to buy them through dealers anymore. There's bills dealing with the employment of people with disabilities. So, I mean, just on. And you mentioned the Peace Labor Act, too. It is going to be a session with lots and lots of bills dealing with business, industry, and most of them not in their favor.
Joey, Shaun mentioned public option, and you and I have been on the speaking circuit related to that, and I know that you've written about it. Can you maybe tell those that aren't familiar with what's being proposed and where it is right now a little bit more?
It's a public-private insurance program. You know, I was having breakfast with a Republican friend of mine yesterday. Well, I'll tell you, it's Patrick Neville, the House Republican speaker, and he says that it gets us, I don't know if I agree with this, but in his view, 80 to 90% toward a public option because, you know, it's going to be cheaper below market insurance that's going to pull down the rest of the market. But the way they get there, you know, is with caps and controlling costs. We don't know what that's going to look like. You know, if I'm a business person going into this session, I'm feeling real nervous right now because, you know, the voters have already said that they don't want, no, don't tax me. And then they don't want to spend money on transportation from the existing state budget. I think we're going to see a whole raft of fees to pay for things. And, you know, the public option in healthcare is, you know, the big unanswered question. You know, Patrick had a great line yesterday talking about paid family leave that, you know, Jared Polis is a skeptic and pulling the reins. And he said, you know, it really says something about where this legislature is when Jared Polis is the moderating voice. So take that what you will. You know, healthcare is going to be, I mean, it's the biggest fight we've got going nationally. Look at the candidates we have for president in the shades of Medicare for all. You know, and this is not a new debate for any of us. You know, when as you'll read in my column tomorrow, when Ronald Reagan said, "There you go again," he was dodging a question about health care from Jimmy Carter in the 1980 debate. Here we are 4 decades later, and people still can't answer the question. We're going to try to answer it in Colorado. Let's see if we can do any better than anybody else has.
So, thinking about priorities, you know, I've heard and seen that the governor might have a little bit different priority set than the speaker. And so I'll just open it to the panel. Is there any kind of glimpse or inside baseball on where their priorities fall and how they might differ?
Well, I think the Democrats' priorities are going to be Jared Polis's priorities. What do you think, Ed?
Well, I mean, I think Jared Polis's priorities still lie with education. Now that he's got paid full-day kindergarten throughout the state, he wants to gradually put more money into fully paid pre-K programs. I don't know that I've heard as much enthusiasm from your standard legislator about that as I have from Polis. I think legislators are talking a little bit more about health care and about paid family leave and about labor issues. And I don't know where that middle ground is right now. I think one of the things that's important to know is we talk about what the legislature is putting forward, and for a lot of us that means what House Speaker Casey Becker, what Senate Majority Leader Steve Fenberg, who are really pulling the policy reins in those two chambers, are wanting to put forward. I think you're going to see some reaction from especially the more liberal side of the Democratic caucus, who didn't feel like, and I know that conservatives and businesses feel like they got beat up last year. There's a substantial number of legislators that feel they didn't get what they wanted, that SB 181 was not enough, that they would essentially like to do things that would make it much harder to develop throughout the state. You know, that some of the health care measures that Polis really championed, which were all based on lowering the costs to individuals, weren't enough. We've seen for about 4 years now an effort to put forward a pharmaceutical transparency bill in the name of trying to lower the cost of prescription drugs that's never even gotten out of committee. That's going to be a big cry, not from Polis's office, but probably from the more liberal Democrats this year. So I think that's where some of the fight may be, is how far left do you want to go to appease those elements of the caucus versus what Becker, and I know this may sound strange to some, Becker has tried to be a pragmatist in what she's steering down the middle. Can she keep that going or not?
Shaun, any thoughts on that?
I think a lot is going to depend on the revenue forecast that comes out this next week, what they can and they can't do. We're hitting the second tier of Tabor. That means income taxes are going to drop from, I think, 6.3 to 4.5. That's a lot less revenue the state is going to be taking in. So anything with a fiscal note is probably DOA.
Well, I wonder, though,
Well,
if
but-
we can, Shaun, I wonder if we can trust the numbers that we're hearing. I mean, every major proposal that Polis has marched out, a couple of 3 months later, we're finding out it's
Right.
going to cost a lot more than they said it was going to
Yeah,
cost.
all-day kindergarten, for example, right?
Yeah.
So 100 million more, so,
Yeah, you know,
right,
what's
that's
100,
exactly right.
200 million
But, you know,
among
what's
friends?
interesting, what we're not talking about, which we talk about seemingly every session, is transportation. And I ask, where's the bills on transportation? They don't even have one. There's not a single bill right now dealing with transportation. And so that is, I mean, what they're looking at, and I think, Ed, you mentioned it, is fees for transportation. So I think, you know, if they don't have the money, that's where they're going to get it from.
Yeah, if you all ever
Or-
want to be inspired by the legislature, you should not have been at the final meeting of the Transportation Legislative Review Committee this summer, in which they advanced 5 bills on things like license plates and did nothing to address transportation funding.
What are you talking about? Driver's education for foster kids? That's nothing, man. Come on, that's going to get me out of a traffic jam.
What Shaun mentioned there, and I'm sure some of you have read, I know you've done some of this, is that they're looking at the possibility of saying now, well, we can't pass a bond sale or a tax hike or even a revenue retention measure statewide, so let's let local officials get together and see if they can pass some kind of new district, create a new transportation district, create their own funding source, and basically carve up the state into who's willing to pay to improve our transportation system and who's not. And I think at some point early in the session, somebody is going to look at this and say, are we forgetting about all the areas of the state that can't really do this, that can't pass this? Should we be talking again about passing a statewide transportation funding measure beyond the $2.3 billion bond measure that's already set to go on the 2020 ballot, thanks to a 2018 bill? And I think that's the sleeping giant here. Is that's going to rear its head, and somebody's going to say, let's stop talking about everything else and talk about transportation. But I don't know that it goes anywhere.
You know,
It's the haves and the have-nots, just like in education. That's what transportation is going to look
You know,
like.
and tying it back to Chris's presentation, when you watch where transportation is on kind of the buckets and where they're being filled, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's even in the top 5 right now, is that right, or barely? Number 5, so barely, but when you think of transportation, that's something that I think if you've polled and surveyed, and there have been a lot, it's on the top of every Coloradan's mind. It's the number one thing that they want solved. And so there is room, I believe, for some bipartisan solutions. Are you hearing or seeing any inclination of any other bipartisan bills or policy measures that might be moved forward?
No, I
I do.
Yeah,
I cover a little bit different stuff than the two of you sometimes. So I think on mental health, I think we're going to definitely, there are tons of mental health bills that will be coming again this session, and I think we'll definitely see some bipartisanship on those bills.
Anything else?
Yeah, not much else. You know, transportation, I think Democrats make a big mistake in that they look at the last election or two and they assume that everybody's as liberal as they are, and I don't think that's true at all. What I heard Shaun and Ed say a few minutes ago was that, you know, Colorado voters like Republican ideas. They just don't like Republicans right now, unless they're named Mike Kaufman. So, I don't know, but you assume that, that the state is as liberal as Progress Now is as foolhardy as saying that, Colorado is Alabama. It's just not.
Right.
Yeah, I'll tell you where it's not a bipartisan idea, but the idea that Jared Polis has put forward and has been flatly rejected by his own caucus of eliminating specific tax breaks in order to bring down the overall corporate income tax is one that some members of the Republican Party, particularly Senator Jack Tate, have kind of caught on to, and they've said, let's work together to find some way to do this. The problem with that is that's, a bipartisan between, a governor who's not speaking the same language as his caucus and a Republican who's in his last year and isn't often on the same page as much of his caucus. So if it's going to be bipartisan, it needs a bigger well, but that's one area where there could be some bipartisan support. I just don't see it yet.
So we've talked a lot about the legislative session. Let's switch now and talk about the 2020 ballot and what might be on the ballot next November. And I know a lot of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, we just recovered from this last November. But we recently just pulled the list of different titles that have been filed. And I think it's really fascinating when you look at the overall themes. There's a lot of growth restriction ballot initiatives. There's a potential Tabor repeal, so something mimicking a CC, but in reverse might be on the ballot. Can you all speak to what you're hearing or what you think might be on the ballot in 2020?
Well, the wolf got on yesterday. They're going to reintroduce the wolf in Colorado.
Yeah.
That's solving the problems.
National-
You guys are so down on government. I don't know why.
Yeah,
People
so,
would be.
yeah.
I don't know.
I think national popular vote is
Yeah.
a huge one. And then citizenship to vote, proving your citizenship to vote, that's going to be on it. So those will be big ones. It'll be interesting to see if the late-term abortion ban makes the ballot.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the ballot in 2020, aside from the obvious, the U.S. Senate race is going to be defined by Daniel Hayes' growth limitation measure, if it gets on, capping new residential building permits at 1% per year in each of the 11 most populous counties along the Front Range. I think that's going to be almost a proxy for whether people, enjoy the way Colorado is going or don't. But to Shaun's point, I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of ballot issues intended to push certain demographics to the ballot, whether that be something like the abortion ban, the national popular vote that's going to get out conservatives, whether that's going to be a Tabor repeal that could get out liberals. Although I don't know how you go from losing Prop CC to thinking, yeah, let's go for a Tabor repeal. But I think to be fully honest, that's what people who are putting ballot initiatives forward are thinking now. How do I get people out that will affect the elections, whether or not my measure passes?
Right. I was going to say what Ed said, but people run ballot initiatives for the same reason they rob banks, because that's where the money is. So I don't know how serious some of these ballot initiatives are, but I think they're right. They're about driving votes and about earning paychecks for consultants.
And do you want to talk about the timing? I can chime in too, just on when voters might know if these are going to be on the ballot and the timing. So
It's not till May, is it?
Yeah,
So-
some of them are starting to come in. Once they get their title approved, they have like 60 days to collect their signatures, something like
Yeah.
that, or 90
Is
days.
it
I believe-
August to the cutoff?
I believe it's by March or April we'll know what could be on the ballot.
that's right. So March is final
Yes.
title board hearing.
And then it's not going to be till August that we are actually going to know what's going to be on the ballot. And I think that's going to be key to watch. For example, the growth limitation measure I mentioned is something that Hayes tried to put on the ballot 2 years ago, gave up because he didn't think he could get the signatures. Whether he thinks he can do it this year or not is a different question.
Is
When
Greg
are-
Brophy still trying to get the repeal of daylight savings time on the
That's
ballot?
on the list, Joey. I'm
Making
supportive of
election
that.
day a
This
holiday.
election just keeps getting better. I thought it was just going to be about Trump and Gardner, but now we got daylight savings time and wolves to worry about. So maybe they're connected. I don't know.
Well, really want to thank you all for being here. I'm sure that you all have a lot of questions as well, so I'd like to turn it over to the audience at this point. We have a little bit of time for that too. Buzz, do you want to start?
I'm going to take a little
Sure.
board member prerogative here, Buzz Coble. It's going to be a plug for CSPR, but also there was a lot of questions today about policy, and is it really policy that shifts these numbers? When 2 years ago in the session we were working on the para, unfunded liability situation and the very big concerns, Chris and our entire team, there were 7 or 8 different variables with the para situation that could have dramatically helped and improved the unfunded liability situation. And we were very close to getting some of those passed. The last minute, teachers' unions and other forces took over, And what they did is they took basically $250 million of increased revenue in the state from the Trump tax cuts and just simple growth, and they shifted it all over to protect para, whereas one of our pitches not only gave them a lot of possibilities and variables to improve it and understand the information we gave them, but we also felt growth should pay its way. Everybody says growth should pay its way, but what happened in the end is they took the money to prop up para. So that's an example of the policy issue. But I'm saying this for two reasons. One is continue to check out our website. We have a lot of information, but the more important thing is, I think if everybody in this room and a lot of other people don't use this information to try and help direct policy and get involved and get active in terms of protecting our state, and particularly the businesses, then shame on us. And so the point of this was to make a pitch for what we do and how we try and accomplish it. But more importantly, we do that because we want to provide information to all of you and others to help get more solid policies put in place. So sorry for the plug, but I had to do it.
That's great. Other questions or comments? Myron?
Sure. We talked about CC and how badly it's done destroyed. Clearly, all three of you used the word transportation. I can't even tell you how many times. Okay, and transportation was at CC. And when I'm out there in my little world, talking to actually people who drive on the roads, okay, the problem with the legislature or anything that happens that comes out of there, they always use the word transportation. Transportation to the average citizen is a buzzword. You're going to waste my money. Okay? Because it's not defined. If you were to put something on the ballot or a CC that said, okay, this is going to go to roads, 100% to roads, which is what people are complaining about. They're not complaining about transportation. They're complaining about roads and bridges, etc. And part of that would have to be that you cannot reduce the current funding, because that's the game they play.
Right.
All right, we're going to give you another $100 million out of CC or whatever the amendment is, but then, we're going to cut here and use it for our pet projects and green up the roads and green up the medians and all that, which they call transportation, which doesn't solve transportation, the road problem. So if they were ever honest and actually came out with a tax increase that was specific without taking from the bucket, I think it would pass in this state.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that.
I
John
don't know,
Caldera
yeah.
ran a bill called Fix Their Damn Roads last year.
Right, and
You know,
listed the projects.
Maybe he
you know,
should
I
have
mean-
used a different four-letter word. It would have had a better chance. I don't know.
But I think you're right, on people want to know,
It's a buzzword, I'm not voting for it.
yeah, I mean, Ref C, right? What happened with that, and people think about that. I think, too, I heard from a lot of people that they were bothered by the fact that CC was permanent, right? You're going to take these taxes, my tax liability goes up permanently. How much is that money down the road, right? And what if things go wrong? What if you put money in on one end and you take it out on the other, so it's, net neutral? It ends up being for education and transportation. What recourse do I have at that point, It doesn't sunset, right? I know they do audits, but then what,
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm going to run a ballot initiative called Fund My Pork and see if I can get people to vote for it because they fund my pork. So, I think you're right. I think people see, why the government, Colorado, they got $34 billion. Why do they need my $32 tax refund? Why can't they just manage the money that they have? I don't think people connect the dots of how government works, or maybe they do.
Ken?
Maybe if CDOT can pass an audit capital's money, regular projects somewhere in the state, and somewhere here on budget on time, people will really need money.
Yeah, if they pay attention to that, if they actually pay attention to it, I just think a lot of voters aren't tuned in to that micro level.
I think one of the things that'll be interesting too is that as we are talking about roadways here, Governor Polis is talking mostly about a front range rail system. And I wonder, A, how much he is going to continue pushing that. I think it's a big deal to him, and he will continue pushing it. And B, the more that he continues to push it, will that continue to erode the voters' confidence that any ask for transportation, including this $2.3 billion bond initiative that's going up in next fall's election, will just fund that and hurt the chances of anything passing?
One last question. Brock?
I was just going to, and I appreciate the conversation. This is probably the first legislative budget discussion I've been in probably a decade where somebody hasn't brought up or said, well, marijuana will solve that problem.
Right.
We're going to smoke our way out of
Well, we forgot to bring it up. That was it.
I would be interested, though, in coming from the three of you, your perspectives, how, at least in my mind, that conversation has shifted, even at the General Assembly. It's no longer the pot at the end, for lack of a better word. They really, I mean, the cash funds that the state has allocated, those are running pretty much on autopilot, so if not below. That it's no longer marijuana is going to solve this problem or help us fix it. I would be interested in your kind of global perception around our budget and how marijuana has kind of fallen from this is one of our top 2 or 3 ways to help fix it to where, I mean, I was in the Joint Budget Committee late last week and they said there's no more new money coming in from marijuana. So I'd be interested in your perceptions of how that plays in to kind of what Chris put up there with the shifting buckets of where the money is going. I'd be interested in your perspective.
So Ed's the beer expert. Who's the pot expert up here?
Hey, why's everybody looking at me? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. You know, they go to that well so much, but you know that money was supposed to pay for specific things that I can't remember right now. But
Prevention efforts.
You're right. Yeah,
Law enforcement.
maybe we just need to legalize more drugs and we can get our highways fixed.
Tax them.
Heroin for highways. That's my ballot.
On that note, could we all give our panelists today one big round of applause? Thank you all for being here. Loved hearing your insight. It was great. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on an early morning. Luckily, we didn't have snow this morning. We hope that you found today's program educational and informative. As a nonprofit, this is my plug, which Buzz started, we rely on support from individuals like you to conduct our research. It is tax deductible. There are contribution forms on the table, or you can check out our website, which is up on the screen. But more than that, please share our work, subscribe to our biweekly Common Sense Digest newsletter, like our social media, and again, maybe cover the cost of breakfast with a little contribution today. We will be announcing our quarterly schedule in early 2020 for Eggs in the Economy. We'll make sure that it's on all of your calendars. But thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it.